Well, hey, welcome. I am Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I am really glad that you're with me today. Now, I have 3 kids, and when our first child was born, it was a weird experience taking her home from the hospital. We have 9 months to prepare for this moment, but it was so new and out of the ordinary, it kind of didn't compute. So when we left the hospital, we had her in her little car seat, but it felt like we were doing something wrong, like we're stealing a baby. We kept thinking that a nurse is going to run out of the hospital and be like, "What are you doing? You can't take that child." And then having a baby in the back seat instead of a pregnant wife in the front seat, it was surreal. It was one of the happiest moments of our lives, but there was this other side of it. So in the weeks before Terry went into labor, we were just sitting talking about all the things that we needed to do to prepare, and we were talking about everything that was going to change. And Terry got really sad. She said, "This is the last time it's ever going to be just the 2 of us." She wasn't sad about future sleep deprivation or the fact that we were going to be pooped and peed on for the next few years. She was sad that it was never going to be just the 2 of us again. Even though our new family era was going to be amazing, it was still the end of a different but equally amazing era. We all tend to break our lives down into eras, into seasons that have a beginning and an end before a next season begins. We all have these peak eras too, when things are great. Let me show you. When do you think music was the best? That's your peak era. If you think Tupac's music is better than hip hop today, that's your peak era. If you think One Direction was peak pop music, that's your era. Whichever of Taylor Swift's album touches your soul the most, that is your era. And whether it's the 80s hair metal of Poison or the 50s doo-wop of the Pecan Sandies, the era when you thought music was the best is probably your peak era. And whether it's graduating high school or changing careers, getting married or having grandkids, our lives are made up of eras that have a beginning and an end before a new and different era follows. And these segments, they mark our big transitions and they help us to track the trajectory of our lives, of our story. God's story also has eras, moments of change and transition that help us understand the trajectory of his plans and purposes for our world. People in Jesus' day, they thought that he stood right at the center of one of these inflection points that signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. Many people today call that era the end times. The end times have spawned books, movies, and conferences. A whole industry has been built up around knowing when the end times are going to happen. Jesus did speak about this, but in ways that were confusing and hard to understand. So how do we make sense of it all? Is Jesus talking about the end times or the end of the world or the end of something else entirely? Well, today we're going to start a 4-week message series through one of these dialogues that Jesus had in Matthew chapter 24. And it's one that has fundamentally shaped how people think about the end times. But before we begin, I want to give you some background. It's the final week of Jesus' life, and the confrontation between the corrupt temple system and Jesus has really come to a head. He's been in the temple directly confronting and condemning the hypocritical sin of the religious leaders and the system of religion that they've built because it was broken, it was unjust and corrupt. And at the beginning of Matthew 24, we find Jesus just after leaving the temple. And this is what he says in Matthew 24, 1 through 3, or what happens. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to all of its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple. And the disciples are like, "Look at that thing. It's gorgeous. It's the most beautiful temple in the world." And they weren't wrong. The temple in Jerusalem was well known as being one of the most wondrous pieces of architecture in the ancient world. It was stunning. And in response, Jesus said, "Yeah, but all those things you see, they're going to be destroyed. brick by brick, stone by stone, until nothing is left. Now, I'm not sure the disciples knew what to do with this. The temple was the holiest place in the Jewish world. It was where God resided. Predicting its destruction, it was like cursing the God of Israel. It was blasphemy. In fact, it was talking about the destruction of the temple that gave the Jewish leadership the legal authority they needed to have Jesus arrested and put to death. And when the disciples heard this, they had a few questions. When is this going to happen? What will the signs be? How will we know that it's the end of an age? Well, the story continues here in Matthew 24, verse 4. Jesus answered them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So I got lost there for a second. It's a long passage, but here's the thing. Again, many people read this as the end times, when Jesus returns to usher in the end of the world. There'll be wars, natural disasters, false prophets. I mean, this sounds like the first draft of one of the Left Behind books: rapture, persecution, apocalypse. It sounds like these will be the events in our modern day that will precipitate the second coming of Christ. But let's really look at that. First of all, the disciples, they had no reason to believe that Jesus was going away for a long time before returning. Why would he? They had no idea of a second coming because they had no idea of a first leaving. In addition, check this out. The word translated as coming here in the Greek, it's the word Perusia. It means arrival or presence. But Perusia was also used as a formal word for the visit of a king or dignitary. A king may have a Perusia where he arrives to honor and acclaim in a town or village. Some may see this passage as being about Jesus' second coming in the end of the world, but I'm not sure that's what's happening here. What if we look at this through a different lens? Different than what we've traditionally been taught about the end times, but what if we look at this more literally? What if when Jesus talked about the destruction of the temple, the disciples took him at his literal word? What if they connected the temple's destruction to Jesus' installation as the Messianic King of Israel, his Perusia? And what if they see this not as the end of the world, but as the end of Israel's 600-year era of occupation and oppression by first the Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and finally Roman empires? What if they see it instead as the beginning of a new Messianic era? Let me tell you a story. From the moment the Roman Empire took possession of Judea, or the traditional land of Israel, there were those in the Jewish population who fought back, and fought back hard. There were these military leaders who would regularly rise up, they would build a following, and they would fight Rome. And when this happened, people would often see these leaders as a Messiah who has come to save them. Some of these men actually claimed to be the Messiah. Now, inevitably, their insurrection would be put down by Rome and they would be killed. Their followers would disperse until a new Messiah popped up, and then this pattern would repeat over and over again. Some of these rebellions, they could last for years, with Jewish forces taking back large portions or parts of the land, at least until these revolts were ultimately put down. And these little wars between Rome and Jewish rebels, they became this regular part of the ongoing tension in Judea for decades. And the young church, it was right at the center of this as it expanded across the ancient world. In spite of the brutal persecution that the church faced from both the Jewish establishment and the Roman Empire, it was growing. And it was in this mix of war, persecution of the church, and this rotating cast of potential messiahs that things came to a head in the early to late 60s. In 66 AD, some Jewish young men, they went around Jerusalem mocking a Roman governor who was demanding taxes from the Jewish people. He didn't like that. And in response, he sent soldiers to a marketplace where they indiscriminately slaughtered every person they encountered. As a show of Roman strength, he even had more innocent people crucified after this. This kicked off a Jewish revolt, another war, but this time the revolutionaries were actually able to take back Jerusalem and hold it for the next 4 years. Over that time, these different Jewish military leaders or messiahs, they would rise up and gain power. And because each of these leaders wanted to be in charge, conflict arose between them. As a result, it split the people into factions, and they fought among each other for control of the city. And sensing this weakness, the Roman general Titus, he began a siege of Jerusalem in April of 70 AD. His army surrounded the city, preventing any food, supplies, or people from going in or out. And with no way to get supplies in, things inside Jerusalem got worse and worse. There wasn't enough food, and a famine set in. People were stealing what they could from others. They even starved their own children to feed themselves. There were reports of cannibalism. And the infighting between the Jewish factions, these Jewish militias, got worse. They were slaughtering their own people inside a starving city, while the Romans just patiently waited outside for it to come to an end. Finally, 4 months into the siege, Roman forces breached the city, and they went on an uncontrollable rampage. They killed everyone that they came across. They stacked the bodies in the entrance of the temple. There were so many dead that a literal river of blood flowed down the temple steps. And at the end of it all, tens of thousands of people were killed. The city was burned down, and the temple was destroyed stone by stone. Now, after that story, let's go back 40 years to where we started. Jesus said the temple would be completely destroyed. His disciples asked, when? When is this going to happen? What are the signs? Will that be the end of our era of occupation and the beginning of your reign as king? Knowing what we know now, let's look again at Jesus' reply. He said there will be wars and rumors of wars. There will be persecution and violence as people claiming to be messiahs rise up to take control. There will be famine, and family members will turn against each other in the midst of all of it. When you know the story of the fall of Jerusalem, it all starts to sound the same, doesn't it? So what does this mean? Perhaps Jesus isn't describing the end of the world as we know it. Maybe he's describing the coming end of an era, the transition from an era of temple dominance and corrupted religion to a new messianic era. Not an era of a new military empire, but one of love, justice, and restoration. A new era where his kingdom is advanced, not through a nation, but through people, through his church. When we begin to understand and read the Bible as it is, a story unfolds that's so much bigger than we realized. It doesn't show us a God who wants to rain down indiscriminate violence on his creation as punishment, but it shows us a God who loves his people so much that he wants to protect them from the cruelty and violence that human beings inflict on each other. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to continue looking at what Jesus had to say about the end of the age that I think culminated in the destruction of the temple. And it's going to be historical and it's going to be interesting, but we can still find some individual takeaways. And we can find one today by looking back at the passage we looked at. So let's take a look back again at Matthew 24:12. Jesus said, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. After Jesus describes the horrible events in the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, he says something very important. because people have embraced selfishness, violence, division, and false messiahs, their love will grow cold. In fact, it's this lack of love that perpetuates wickedness and injustice. The diminishing love people have for each other, it's at the center of the collapse of the temple era of religious dominance. That love that collapsed, it's like a Jenga piece that when it's removed causes the whole tower to fall down. At the center of this massive tragedy is the love people have for each other growing cold. But he also says that those who will be saved in the end are those who stand firm in love. All of this applies to those of us in the church today. We can look at the events in the Bible and we can get caught up trying to piece them together to make sense of our world. We can create apocalyptic timelines and look for signs of the end times in every world event. And we can allow those projections to become more important than people. I mean, if Israel is God's people and war in Israel is a sign of the end, then any injustice visited on the enemies of Israel, their Palestinian enemies, including those who are innocent, it's justified. It's all part of God's end time plan, right? Or if wickedness is a sign of the coming judgment of God, then making enemies of wicked people, it's justified. And we can cheer on the punishment of everyone outside of our zone of righteousness because they aren't really people. They're just a sign of the end times. And someone has to burn. The problem with getting so wrapped up in interpreting the events of the Bible is that we can miss the basic principles of Jesus. Like the people of Jerusalem in the first century, we can look for messiahs to come and save us from the evil of government oppression and completely miss the fact that our love for others has grown cold. But our strength isn't found in creating a Christian nation, or in how well we oppose wickedness, or in how much persecution we can face for our values. Our strength is and always will be how we love. So here's our takeaway today. When the world's on fire, love lets us stand firm. Not forcing our values on others, or violence, or retreating into our Christian bubbles. Love. The good news is this. You don't have to be afraid of the end times. You don't have to be afraid of things that are in the Bible. If these events are going to happen, they're going to happen. We can't control them. And that's okay. Because it's not the strength of our opposition that lets us stand firm. It's the strength of our love that does. And even when it seems like the events of 70 AD echo over and over again in our world, we can take comfort in the fact that God's love for us and our love for others echo louder and longer. And when the end of our era comes, there's one thing that's going to remain, and that is our love. Stick with me over the next several weeks as we walk through some of this complex and complicated stuff, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining me.